This is Marcus Whitney's audio universe.
Like, you gotta do the work. You gotta show up and just do the work.
Happy Thursday. What's up? What's up? Another episode of Marcus Whitney Live. We are just going to dive right in. And I want to just preface this with this is a friend of mine. I've already had his brilliant, incredibly talented wife on the show, the Creative Power Hour that I used to do when we were all able to meet each other in person. So I would have preferred to be able to do this episode in person, but alas, COVID-19, we're having to do it through Zoom. But it's great to have him on the show. He is a fantastic cook. He has a wonderful sense of humor. But the reason why he's on the show today is we're going to talk about the work that he does as the editor-in-chief of a publication based out of New York called SupChina, that really covers China with a context and a level of intelligence that you rarely get in mainstream media here in the United States. And so I'm really, really excited to have a conversation with my friend, Jeremy Goldkorn. Jeremy, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, Marcus. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm really glad to have you here. With your accent, people might not expect you to be somebody who for a living writes about China. So can you just give us a little bit of background about your relationship with China and sort of how you got to this place?
Sure. I was born and grew up in South Africa, where I lived for the first 20-something years of my life, went to college. And then I decided, for some reason, excuse me, that I wanted to go to China. And I think part of it was I just wanted to get as far away from home as possible. But at the time, it was pre-internet, where very, very early days of the internet. This was 1994. And I had no idea how to get a job in China. So I went to London and lived there for about a year looking for a job. And I eventually answered a newspaper ad back in the days when newspaper ads were still a thing.
Right.
And I got a job teaching English at a factory in Beijing. And I ended up, I thought I'd be there for a year or two. I ended up spending 20 years there and working mostly in the media.
Wow, that's incredible. So that frames it up brilliantly. And you now live here in the United States.
I do, in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yes. You have a lovely family. And maybe just a little bit. You married a woman from China. Who is brilliant? Who's brilliant, but I think it's one thing to have moved there. It's another thing for your family to be Chinese.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the strange thing is when Faye and I met, she was living in the United States, and I was living in China. And when we got together, she moved back to China, and she had to actually depend on me for her residence visa in China.
Wow. Because
she was an American citizen by that point.
Yeah.
So, and then when we moved to the United States, I had to depend on her to get my green card. And of course, everyone we meet looks at us and thinks, the Chinese woman and the white guy, it must be, he's got the green card. But in fact, it was the other way around.
Yeah. So,
so I do have family in China. Faye has a very large family, and I have a lot of good friends there too. After living there for 20 years, you can imagine.
Yeah, so that is a great segue into what you do today. You're the editor-in-chief of a publication called SupChina. I follow you on Twitter, and you're kind of like my primary true source of information about China. Just like I check your Twitter account, and I sort of go to the articles and also just the commentary that you make. 2020, obviously, in the world, China is a massive force. For many, many, many reasons. But in 2020, the storyline is particularly intense on several fronts. There's obviously coronavirus, which at least as we best understand it, originated in Wuhan. There is the story of what's happening with Hong Kong, this year, and is a long-standing, British, empire, narrative, but this year has really sort of hit a peak. And then, of course, there's the relationship with the President of the United States and the narrative that he's framing around China. So, as someone who has been covering China, does this year feel any more intense in terms of the the purpose of the work that you are doing in terms of trying to communicate, as you've said, sympathetically, and not sympathetic to the government, but sympathetic to the lack of context that many people have when they are hearing sound bites about China. You know, does your work feel more important this year than it has in the past?
I think it does. It also, in some ways, is much more difficult to do with the heightened emotions. It's not only the United States that is having tensions with China. Many other countries are: Australia, many European countries, Britain, Germany, Japan. But they are most intense between the US and China. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. On the one hand, these are the two, superpowers, really.
That's
Russia
right.
isn't there economically and militarily, is going to be trailing behind the Chinese fairly soon. So they are the two, most important countries by size and number of bombs and money, if you could put it that way.
Right.
And they're also really at each other's throats. And many of the reasons are natural. On the one hand, you have the incumbent hegemon, as the Chinese might put it, the reigning superpower, who since the 1990s has been alone at the top of the world stage, and now China is nipping at its heels, and that's uncomfortable for America. It's very uncomfortable, and some of the reaction I think we're seeing is because of that. And on the other hand, China, it has grown so very fast, and in some ways it hasn't become a more responsible country. The human rights situation has actually gone backwards in the last 10 years, seriously backwards. You have actual concentration camps in the far west of China, interning maybe more than 1 million Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority. You have Hong Kong, where they were supposed to be promised 50 years of autonomy from Beijing. So even though in 1997, Hong Kong, a former British colony, went back to the being ruled by the People's Republic of China, they were supposed to have legal and political autonomy, freedom of the press, stuff people didn't have in China. And the Chinese government has made a lot of very aggressive moves to basically stop that, most notably this national security law, which has frightened not only journalists and activists, but also business people. So it's a very intense time. Then you have our president, who seems intent at the moment, and particularly in the last few months, on blaming China for everything that is going wrong in America, including the coronavirus, which, yes, China covered up in the early days. And yes, it's almost certain that that's where the virus came from. But we've known about it in the United States since January. And it's not China's fault that, we have the world's, by far the world's highest number of cases. So that's a long answer to say it's very intense right now.
Yeah, no, it feels intense, and I generally feel like it is very difficult to get good information. Like it is very difficult to get good information, right? And I think for many of the reasons that you just stated, on the one hand, it is, I'm oversimplifying, but on the one hand, it's an adversary of the United States, and so I have to use a filter for the information I get here, right? Because I know it's going to have bias and propaganda sort of built into it. I understand that. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It just sort of is what it is. And at the very same time, it's clear that the regime that is running China is not running by a great playbook, right? And so you can't really trust the information that comes out of there in almost any regards. I mean, it feels like a very, very tough space to be in if you're trying to be an educated person about the matter.
Absolutely. And even within the sort of the field of China scholarship, and ranging from people who study defense to economics and politics, there's this debate at the moment: did we get China wrong by engaging with it? Was the original sin actually Nixon starting off relations with China in 1978 and switching from Taiwan. And we helped build this Frankenstein monster that is now, going to eat our lunch. That's an argument that's very current, and people are very passionate about it because you have scholars, politicians, business people who spent the last 20, 30 years encouraging the United States to engage with China, universities, companies, government-to-government exchanges,
Yes.
people-to-people exchanges. And some of them feel as though they've made a mistake, and some of them don't, and they're defending their positions. And there are people on the other sort of side of the camp who perhaps have always been a little bit more suspicious of China, who are saying, I told you so.
Yeah.
So even within the sort of specialist, China specialist area, it's very contentious. There's a lot of friction. A lot of people are finding themselves having enemies that they never used to have.
The Hong Kong issue feels like a particularly important one for people to understand. So can you maybe give a short history lesson on exactly what happened in that agreement between Britain, Hong Kong, and China, and this 50-year window, right, of independence that was supposed to happen. I know it, but I know it in bits. I understand that there was this recognition that I think a lot of what you said, the integration that happened with Hong Kong, if it just sort of immediately returned to China, would have been very, very damaging at a minimum economically, but probably on a bunch of other fronts as well. And so there needed to be sort of a reasonable transition period there. But the timing of it, Margaret Thatcher's role, some of those things. Can you maybe give just a quick history lesson? Because I think a lot of people are just seeing it as a human rights challenge, and they're seeing the protests in the street, but they don't understand the history around it.
So in the 1800s, Britain wanted to sell stuff to China, and China didn't really want to buy the stuff. So they ended up, through what is often called gunboat diplomacy, basically forcing their way into the Chinese market, primarily to sell opium. A lot of Chinese people got hooked on opium, and these big British companies, which were, working with the British government, made a lot of money selling opium and other things. And as part of the wars that were fought to get British and other foreign countries, but British is the important part for Hong Kong, to get Britain access to China, they fought wars. And some of the wars ended up in Britain being granted Hong Kong Island and the new territories, one for a limited period of lease and one forever. Now, as the British Empire started falling apart, after the Second World War, and gradually, global opinion turning against the idea of colonies and a bunch of other reasons, Britain came to negotiation with China where they said, okay, we'll give all of these territories back. And they did it in 1997 when there was one of the leases was expiring. And in order to feel that they weren't just abandoning Hong Kong to these awful communists in Beijing, the British negotiated a treaty that would give Hong Kong 50 years of autonomy. That basically China would be responsible for foreign policy and military affairs, but pretty much everything else Hong Kong could run itself. Now, remember, in 1997, China wasn't a part of the World Trade Organization. It was still a very poor country. Nobody in America or anywhere else was frightened of China. No. It was, very poor. I was living there already. It was a poor developing country. So China also, was not in a position to necessarily negotiate harder, even though they may not have liked those terms, because supposedly they were getting Hong Kong back, but Beijing could not completely control it. So Hong Kong came back. China did not do much to mess around with its independence. Even till today, it still has a relatively free press, and until very recently, an independent judiciary and education system. But as the years went on, Hong Kong people, particularly young people, started to develop a sense of identity as Hong Kongers rather than as Chinese. And at the same time, you had the government in Beijing slowly starting to squeeze Hong Kong in various ways, like trying, to put pressure on the Hong Kong government to pass a law insisting on, patriotic education, insisting that, if you mocked the national anthem of China, that was some kind of crime. What brought the situation to a head most recently was that the Hong Kong government tried to pass an extradition law that would allow them to extradite without trial people to the mainland, to the PRC, to the mainland China, and average people in Hong Kong really didn't like this, because there is, has been a very clear difference between the justice system in Hong Kong, which operates, in a similar way to Britain or America, and within mainland China, where it's, there are secret police who can disappear you in the middle of the night, and they can charge you, and no habeas corpus, et cetera, et cetera. These demonstrations got so big that they started to threaten, make Beijing feel threatened that they were going to go out of control. So they started to react to them. And what they came down with was a number of measures, but it's sort of the most important of which is they imposed from Beijing, the Beijing government imposed a law on the Hong Kong government called the National Security Law. And it's think of it as the Patriot Act on steroids. It gives the government sweeping powers to arrest people and stop them doing from any kind of activity that is interpreted as seditious or as against the government of Hong Kong or the government of the mainland. And they followed this through with refusing foreign correspondence visas, arresting local activists, arresting local politicians, police intimidation of activists, banning of demonstrations, etc. So now we're left in a situation where it's very uncertain. What is clear is that the old Hong Kong is gone. Freedom of expression is no longer guaranteed. An independent judiciary and education system are no longer guaranteed. And this has spooked a lot of Western investors who used to think of Hong Kong as a place where you have access to China, but you have a Western-style legal and financial system. Some people say Hong Kong is going to collapse because of this, but on the other hand, you now have a lot of Chinese money that is flooding into Hong Kong, buying up houses that other investors may not want. So I think Hong Kong economically is not going to die, but it's going to be a very different place than it was.
Wow. So gosh, I'm going to ask you sort of the $1 million question that is not a fair question, but just because we have effectively 10 minutes left in this show, we are in one of the worst economic situations that the United States has ever been in right now. Yet we have, stock market highs happening. We have an economic entanglement with China such that the vast majority of our N95 masks have been coming from there. And the healthcare system is realizing, oh my gosh, we have to re-domesticate this stuff, but that's going to take years. It's going to take years to do. We have a questionable future for the dollar, given the Federal Reserve's monetary policies that have been put in place in order to try to stabilize our economy with the kind of bankruptcies and job losses that we've been experiencing this year as a result of the shutdowns. And then there's China, that has been gradually becoming much, much stronger than they were in the 90s when those negotiations were happening. What are some likely scenarios that can play out over the course of the next 4 to 5 years in this storyline between the United States and China? What are the kinds of things where tension or power dynamics are in such a place that we should be paying attention to, and what are the storylines that, as you're building, your understanding of where the future is going, what are the key storylines?
Okay, well, let me start with the worst one, which is actual war, and that I worry about that because you have a government that has a need in the United States. You have a government that has a need to distract from various failures. And you have a Chinese government that is partly built on resurgent nationalism, with a leader, Xi Jinping, who is a very different kind of person from Trump, but he's also sees himself as he wants to make his place in history. And he is also a nationalist. And he is a Machiavellian, more than happy to use repressive means to get what he wants. And you have a lot of tensions in the South China Sea, where you have sometimes near misses between Chinese planes and boats and American planes and boats. And I can see something going wrong. And with the current global situation and Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in charge, an actual war. And, perhaps a democratic president would be the same. They might not be able to reduce the risks of that. So that's my worst case scenario.
Okay.
I think another thing that I could see is that the US is spending so much energy right now on blaming other people for our problems. We're not investing in, we're not even investing in infrastructure, but we're not investing in science. We're not investing in technology. In fact, quite the reverse.
Yeah,
the government
that's right.
seems to be saying, let's not have anything to do with that horrible science stuff. Whereas China the government is very serious about investing in science and technology and encouraging national champions. There's a much more, it's the sort of horrible Orwellian authoritarian version of it, but it's a bit like Silicon Valley in its early days, where you have this mixture of government projects and government money and private sector energy and expertise, and all kinds of innovations are going to come out of it. And it feels to me that America, we're just blaming China essentially for a lot of our failings.
Can I just add in a really serious,
Please.
but also unbelievable anecdote to that? Space Camp had to do a GoFundMe to stay alive.
Right.
Space Camp.
Right.
Okay. Please continue.
Yeah,
I just want to say, for anyone who thinks that what you're saying is not real about the United States, we have totally privatized our responsibility to advance science.
Right.
Totally.
And in some ways we're discouraging it. So I could see a scenario where America is, in 5 years is recognizable as a sort of developing country, kind of like Brazil or South Africa, where you have a very rich elite who, live a great developed country lifestyle, right. But there's huge inequality, and the country is slowly moving backwards in many, key
important
factors.
ways. Many
Whereas
important
China
ways.
It might be an awful repressive place, but science and technology are forging ahead, and with that will go their economic and military strength. That would be another scenario.
Yeah, and I want to punctuate something you just said. You are not equating their advances in science and technology to their advances in humanitarian, basic fundamentals, right?
No, unfortunately, one thing that China has proved to me is that freedom is not a prerequisite for innovation. And I think that's something that in the US is sort of it's a truth universally acknowledged, that of course, if we didn't have this freedom, we couldn't innovate. I think the Chinese have, and the Soviet Union proved it before the Chinese, so it shouldn't really be a shock, but it shows that you can have innovation in a system that isn't free. And that's not the only thing we've got going for us. There has to be other things.
Right.
There has to be society, the government has to be invested in progress. Otherwise we won't make any.
Wow. Okay. Please continue, because that was a heavy one for me.
Okay. So those are two scenarios, neither of them particularly good.
No, those are not good.
I don't know if I've got an optimistic scenario for you, Marcus. I guess the optimistic one is that the US comes out of the pandemic. We fix some of the many things that the pandemic has revealed to be broken. And the country starts, investing in itself again. But for China, I should not, since we're running out of time, I shouldn't avoid talking about China's weaknesses, because sometimes China can seem like this, it's impossible to stop.
Yeah.
It is also a very weak and fragile country. And one of the reasons I believe it has become more authoritarian under Xi Jinping is because he's terrified of it falling apart. All around its borders, from, the far west where they're locking up all the Muslims, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, the island that, China claims as its own, but now wants to be independent. You have people who do not want to be a part of the Chinese project. Most of China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, India, are either very wary of China or just about hostile to it. You have so many social problems in China that are not obvious now because they're being repressed. You have vast inequality. So China is very fragile. And I can also see a scenario where something happens, another major flood or a pandemic, and China collapses into a state of anarchy or civil war, or just becomes a much less intimidating country because it just cannot keep this pace of growth together.
And I think maybe to juxtapose that to the United States a little bit, the United States has seemingly been very strong in terms of its view around the world. Now that has been impacted over the last 4 years based on some of our foreign policies, but it has a history of having been strong. And in fact, I would say, even looking at the continued willingness of so many of our, historical allies to continue to kind of hang in there to see if we can work out our internal stuff. That precedent is a real strength that the United States has, whereas China doesn't have that to sort of rely on.
It does. And I mean, democracy may seem broken in the United States, but at a local level, it still works pretty well. Even here in Nashville, the local government is responsive. I mean, it's not perfect by any means,
right? But
it is, for someone who grew up in apartheid South Africa and then lived my adult life in China, it's truly remarkable to see local democracy working, to see, the kind of people who, even in Nashville can get representation in our city government. It's, there is a resilience there that gives me hope.
That is a great point to end on. You've got a podcast. Let's quickly give a plug for that. Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Sure. It's called the Sinica Podcast. I do it with an old friend of mine named Kaiser Guo, who's an American Chinese. We were friends in Beijing, and we interview people about pretty much any subject, current affairs in China.
Awesome. Jeremy, this was incredible. Thank you so much for making time to, educate me, educate the audience. I mean, this is one of those topics where I think people, they want to understand it, but like I said, it is hard. It's hard to get good information on the topic. And, you feel like to a degree you have to be sort of a scholar about it. And so you're doing a great service, making it approachable, understandable, and I think also being balanced in your assessments, of the pros and cons and the scary potentials, but also, some of the maybe, the upside opportunities that are there as well.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. Really enjoyable talking to you.
Thank you. Everybody out there, you can follow Jeremy at Goldkorn on Twitter. His Twitter account's on fire. He's got, I think, over 100,000 followers on there. Is that right?
I think they're all bots, but yeah.
The bots are tracking him. And SupChina, SupChina.com is where you can actually follow the publication. They have a paid version where they send out special newsletters to their paid subscribers. So definitely check it out if you're trying to get up to the moment reporting from the United States with, sort of a good contextual lens on what's happening in China. My book, Create and Orchestrate, you can grab it in stores right now. The podcast, Marcus Whitney's Audio Universe, everywhere that you subscribe to and listen to podcasts. And of course, you can follow me online at Marcus Whitney everywhere. And that's it. I will see you back here tomorrow for the last episode of the week, Marcus Whitney Live. Until then, let's build a new normal, y'all. Peace.
Thank you for tuning in to Marcus Whitney's Audio Universe.